So I will take it back to when I first came to the archive, which I began working in 1980 as a student worker, and then I became a staff member in 83, then I became acting curator in 88, and then I got the job and started in 89. We were on the 4th floor of Howard Tilton, and it was different. The configuration was largely the same. We had like 2 listing rooms, more or less, this size, and some offices, but we didn't have as much space. Special collections moved en masse, with the exception of Latin American Library, because we had run out of space on the 4th floor of Howard Tilton. And so when they created the high-rise law school farther down Ferret, it vacated this building, and initially it looked like we might get the whole building, and then we ended up with less space, but we ended up with a new space that we could work with that bought us some time for growth, but not as much as we originally thought.
When you first started as a student worker, what was your job here?
Well, a little of everything. I had come to the Hogan Jazz Archive to meet Dick Allen when I was teaching history at University College. And the son of a collector named Al Rose, his stepson, Forrest, was taking my class, and he shows up one day with some photos of his stepfather and my dad in Philadelphia in 1947 doing a radio interview together. My father was a big band leader, my mother was a jazz singer. So I was, shall we say, pretty interested in the background, and Forrest told me, well, my dad wants to meet you, but also there are more pictures like this and other material related to your father at the Jazz Archive, so go meet Dick Allen. That was about 1976 or so. And so I came over and I met Dick, and Dick was under duress. He was actually the person who came up with the idea that became the Archive of New Orleans Jazz. In 1958, William Ransom Hogan, the chair of the Department of History, wrote a grant to the Ford Foundation. Against stiff opposition, they prevailed, and they got $154,000 to do oral history field work. And this was based on an idea that Dick Allen had brought to him, which was to do a master's thesis using oral history techniques to interview early jazz musicians in New Orleans. And once the Ford money came in, Dick's master's project pretty much got pushed to the side, and Dick was hired as the number 2 when they brought in Bill Russell, who was a preeminent jazz historian, record producer, avant-garde composer of percussion music and whatnot, an early American jazz historian who specialized on New Orleans. Bill became the first curator. So this entire backstory basically is part of the response to your question, which is, how did I start in January of 1980 as a student worker? And it was thanks to Kurt Jurdy, because we knew each other and had worked together both as musicians and as historians. When he took over the archive, he felt that there was a lot of work to be done, and even though he didn't have a very large budget for staff, student workers were making like $1.75 an hour back then. He did have a student worker position. I was a graduate student, so I was eligible, so he asked me if I wanted the job, and I accepted it. So I did a little of everything, and worked my way up the ladder over the course of the 1980s. July 1st, 1983 is when I had my first staff position. So eventually I got beyond the student worker status. And when Alma Williams-Freeman, the administrative assistant, went on maternity leave, I took her position on a temporary basis. But in other words, I had an opportunity to learn all the different jobs. So I did a little of everything. The kind of projects I worked on initially, I worked very closely with Dick Allen, processing oral history, so checking transcripts that had been generated from the open reel tapes. I worked on various grant projects, including a Rockefeller project for mark formatting of elements of the sheet music collection, particularly the John Robichaux collection, but cherry picking the stuff of the greatest research interest on jazz, orchestrations by Jelly Roll Morton, for example, or Duke Ellington. And I did another NEA project to create what was dubbed a jazz listening library for secondary school access, and that involved converting 78 records to open reel tape and basically compiling and collating around the artist, picking good examples of their work over time. Interestingly enough, this is right before the digital age impacts, and so conversion to analog tape was actually kind of an anachronistic approach. But we had the money, that was the project, and what it meant was I got to sit with headphones on and listen to thousands of 78s, and so I really deepened my understanding of the repertoire associated with New Orleans jazz. By the end of the 80s, we had also, Kurt and I had put together an LEH, Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities funded project called Louisiana Swing, which was a radio series that combined elements from the oral history collection with the taped 78s that I had been working on for the Jazz Listening Library. And that ran on WWNO and then was picked up and sort of enjoyed national distribution for a number of years, won an award for the Association of State and Local History, etc. So these were good projects, and they all had the advantage of deepening my understanding of New Orleans jazz history, the aesthetics of the idiom. I was in a fortunate position to learn from both Dick Allen and Kurt Jerde. And Kurt could be difficult in terms of his interpersonal skills, but he knew librarianship. He was going very deep on jazz history, and he did a lot of good in terms of sort of upgrading the operations, things like subject folders and tweaking LC subject headings and whatnot. He brought a kind of rigor to the processing of the material and brought in some wonderful collections, particularly the Ray Baduke collection, the drummer Ray Baduke, who's with Ben Pollack and Bob Crosby and the Bobcats. Wonderful collection. Kurt interviewed him. I did a number of oral history interviews with Kurt, presiding. Dave Winstein, for example, and Godfrey Hirsch. Dave Winstein was the head of the local American Federation of Musicians Union for 40 years. And he had been a tenor saxophone player. Very interesting, extensive interview that we did with Kurt. Godfrey Hirsch was a drummer who worked early on with various New Orleans bands, particularly Louis Prima. Went on the road with Louis Prima, went to New York and California with him. Worked for Richard Himber in NBC Studio Radio Orchestra in New York for a number of years, then came back and worked with Pete Fountain as his drummer of choice. Very interesting personal history in terms of the Hirsch family. There were Sephardi Jews who migrated early on in the city's history and had retail outlets down the French Quarter, the Marigny and whatnot. When you interview these musicians, you get more than music history. You get a slice of the neighborhood life and the way New Orleans, the perspectives that New Orleans people bring to how to live in a pretty hazardous environment between storms and plagues and the heat and the humidity and all that. So the 1980s was a learning experience where I really sampled pretty much every position, and Kurt, unfortunately, was in a car accident while he was producing the second of two Tulane hot jazz classics. The first was a series of colloquia and symposia, concerts in tandem with New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival. The second he did independently, but while he was in production mode for that, he was in a car accident and it triggered a condition of multiple sclerosis in him. And that pretty much meant that his days as curator were numbered. So even though when I took the position in 1980 as a student worker, I never really thought I would be fortunate enough to have a shot at getting the curatorship, but that's the way it turned out. And so the university librarian Phil Leinbach in 1988, Kurt's condition had deteriorated to the point where it became obvious he was going to have to retire. So he took medical leave and I became acting curator. They opened the position up, this time with a national search. When Kurt was hired, they didn't do a search, they just hired him under the aegis of Fred Starr. And I was fortunate enough to compete and get the job. And so beginning in January 1989, I became curator of the Hogan Jazz Archive, and then later became director of special collections when Bill Maneri, who mentored me and brought me up, he and Phil Leinbach were basically the two principals that hired me. He had become by that time assistant dean of special collections. When he retired in 2009, I was appointed interim director. They changed it from an assistant dean to a director position at that point. And I didn't really think I'd want the job, but 6 months into being interim, I realized I could juggle both the curatorship of the Jazz Archive and the director of special collections. I felt that I had sufficient talent at the department head level where I didn't have to micromanage anybody to make everything work effectively. And so I've been holding the two positions since 2009.
You travel a lot in your capacity as curator of the Jazz Archive, don't you? You told me about a recent trip. Can you tell us about some of the trips you've taken and the stuff from here that you've brought with you?
In March this year, I had an opportunity to go to Chiasso, Switzerland, to Max Museo, which is a cultural museum that's run by the Comune. And Chiasso is part of Ticino, which is the Italian region in Switzerland. So it's not that far from Milan. Did a little teaching at IULM, International University of Language and Media in Milan. And we shipped a drum set, a couple of clarinets. The drum set belonged to Ray Baduke, clarinets Paul Polo Barnes. One of the first jazz records, one of the copies of the first jazz record, Liver Stable Blues, Dixie Jazz Band One Step, was placed on display along with a number of images related to the first jazz recording. The title of the exhibit was Un secolo di jazz, or yachts, as they would say in Italy. A century's perspective on jazz. My job in going over there and speaking, addressing audiences, doing radio interviews, is to remind them that jazz did not begin with the first recording in New York. There's about 2 decades of development in New Orleans. Then a New Orleans band goes to Chicago, New York, and is documented. So the beginning of the jazz story does not start with a white band from New Orleans, which, by the way, had 2 Italians in it, which is one reason why the Italians are so interested in that narrative. So that backstory in terms of jazz emerging from the black vernacular in New Orleans, it's very important for people to understand that context in order to appreciate not only the importance of the first jazz recording, but the quirkiness of it, that a black vernacular art would be documented for the first time by a white band in New York. Under an era of segregation, there are answers to those questions, obviously. Most of the time when I travel, it has to do with the work I've done as a jazz scholar. Because my training is in history, and because my feeling as curator of the Jazz Archive has always been that at this stage in the archive's lifespan, what was really necessary was promoting the archive and attracting the best scholars possible to work with the material, and then their works become PR for the archive. And that's where I've had the greatest success. And my strategy in accomplishing that was to generate scholarship myself that would provoke a response within the field. And it worked. I go to conferences, I present papers, I get involved in trying to develop new perspectives on jazz origins in New Orleans primarily. And fortunately, I'm happy to say my work has received a very good audience within the field. And it is an interdisciplinary field, so I think that's part of what makes it so interesting, is there are people from ethnomusicology to history to film studies to performance studies people who work on gender. We're all in it together. And so that's what I really enjoy. I embrace the travel. I'll be going to Amsterdam at the end of August for my 5th Rhythm Changes conference, but Rhythm Changes is an international conference, so there are presenters from all over the world. Not only do I get to see old friends that I've been working with for decades, but I get to see up-and-coming talent. And it's important for me to be aware of that and to let those new scholars know about the resources we have at the Hogan Jazz Archive. And I'm happy to say, thanks to Elena Hebert and Lynn Abbott, both staffers at the archive, our homepage has become world-renowned in terms of the depth and the breadth of digital content that we're supplying, not just finding aids, but artifacts, access to oral history, sheet music, graphics material. You can really go deep, and people have noticed. So this is, again, all part of the greater strategy of how do you sell the archive to the scholarly community so that they're not only aware of it, but they proactively use these resources to generate scholarship and sort of increase our knowledge base related to jazz and New Orleans culture. My predecessors took a very narrow collection development focus, particularly when it was called the Archive of New Orleans Jazz. They were only concerned with traditional jazz, not modern jazz players in New Orleans. By the time I became curator, Kurt Jurdy had already moved in the direction of opening up that collection development to include R&B. We have interviews with Professor Longhair and Earl King, Tommy Ridgely, and others that Tad Jones donated to the archive, interviews that he collected. And so Kurt opened that door, and I sort of pushed that envelope as much as I could, because as a scholar, the work I do shows the interconnection between all these genres and the predilection of New Orleans musicians to test boundaries all the time anyway. They don't like being categorized in rigid classifications. They're about experimentation, and so hybridity is part of what they do. They borrow from different genres and create new music that way. Respect tradition, but innovation is also important. It's a wide range of material, heavily audiovisual, but the bibliographic apparatus, we get a book budget. We have about $8,000 a year to keep up with what's being published. We divert a certain amount of that to buying CDs at the Louisiana Music Factory, a local vendor. We think that's the right way to go. And that has sort of brought us up to, we're current now, and we were spending $2,000 to $4,000, almost half of our budget, collecting CDs. I don't think we'll have to do that anymore because we're far enough along. But that's also to emphasize that the collection here has grown by donation, that we were never handed a chest of money and go out and collect. It's always been the trust of the people who did the collecting, hot record collectors, for example, who might have entered that market in the 20s and 30s, a few even earlier than that, in the late teens when the first jazz records were made. They saw at the end of their collecting careers an opportunity for people to have access to their labors of love, which were their collections. And so Al Rose, Danny Barker, Nick LaRocca, Ray Baduke, so many, a very long list of collectors and musicians who have trusted us with their materials. And of course, our obligation is to process that material, but it comes in by donation. Occasionally, we find the money to pick up a collection. The John Robichaux sheet music collection, which is massive, it's thousands of titles, both piano copy and orchestration. It's the working band library of John Robichaux, who was the competition to Buddy Bolden, the kind of avatar of jazz origins in New Orleans, cornet player. And Robichaux eventually became a jazz musician. He was a violinist, but he led the band at the Lyric Theater from 1919 to about 1926. And that tells us about what happened to the market once Bolden sort of shifted, responding to popular taste. what the aesthetics of music in New Orleans were all about. That Robichaud library had been acquired by a band leader named Al Balanco, and so that is another item that was purchased. Another great deal, but it's rare. Most of the time it's by donation, and now because space is at a premium, we really don't bring in large collections anymore. The most recent, however, is an exception. I worked on it, negotiating this donation for 20 years, and that is the Louis Prima collection. And we're going to have a Louis Prima room, converting what had been the Rare Book room in 306 Jones Hall, right next to the Jazz Archive, into a performance and presentation space, and an archival space with a couple of workstations with digital material available, and also artifacts in the various shelves in cabinets surrounding. But it's a room where we can have symposia and presentations, and it's going to be dedicated to Louis Prima. And thanks to the Gia Prima Foundation, there'll be an annual subvention to pay for programming in that room. Sheet music is perhaps not as in demand as oral history, photography, and recorded sound material, but New Orleans musicians tend to use it. The fact of the matter is that oral history presents clues that then require corroboration through other media. And so any musician narrative is going to require that you listen to their music. So the recorded sound materials, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 60,000 items, ranging from cylinders produced in the early 20th century through 78s, LPs of various descriptions, and ultimately CDs. Vertical file material is extremely important for anyone trying to get started, as is reference material. So we have a reference shelf with things like the New Grove Encyclopedia of Jazz, various discographies which are necessary to manipulate our recorded sound collection, which is organized according to record label abbreviation and release number within format. So all 10-inch 78s are together, all 12-inch 78s are together, but sequenced according to an alphabetical record label abbreviation, and then numerically within those classifications by the release number. And so people walking in saying, well, I want to listen to what you have by Louis Armstrong, they need to go to discography, look up Louis Armstrong or King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band or people Armstrong played with, find the record label abbreviation, and then we can check our shelf list and see if we've got it. And we've also been converting those to Excel files. So the 78 collection's been done now, thanks to student workers, as an Excel file. So that at least is an electronic database that can be accessed, as opposed to typing out or computer-driven printing shelf list cards. Vertical file material is organized by person, band, subject, and we also have, and this is rare, the backlog of the American Federation of Musicians, Local 174-496, which is the merged Jim Crow unions that existed from 1902. 174 was the white local. 496 began in 1926. In 1969-70, the National forced them, against stiff opposition, to merge into 174-496. It's extremely rare for AFM locals to deposit their backlogs with archives, but because Kurt Jurdy, who's the one that hammered out the deal with local, was a member, and I was a member of 174-496 for decades as well, they trusted the archivists as members of their organization as well as musicians. And so we are in the unique position of now having the board minutes, having member applications, having log books and account books of these unions. Not too long ago, someone asked us, Emile Stalebread Lacombe, who began playing on the streets as part of the Razzie Dazzie Spasm Band in the late 1890s, Did he ever join the Union, and when did he join the Union? Well, 1921. We found him in the logbook. His name was, it's all longhand, so it's not easy to necessarily make out what's being written, but we were, in this case, able to make it out. We had a date. It made sense. By that time, he was working professionally with jazz bands. So that's a unique set of documents. I don't think there are any other archives that have AFM material. Usually they'd rather toss it than make available, which is a shame because it's invaluable material for reconstructing the economic terrain, particularly New Orleans, the time when jazz was emerging here. I mean, absolutely incredible to have access to that information. And we've been trying very hard to get scholars or graduate students to work with that material, and so far, a few have dabbled, but kind of intense treatment of that information has yet to occur. So there are still opportunities in terms of things that scholars could do with the materials in our collection. The graphics materials, we are up to about 15,000 graphic images now. That's not huge, but it's massive enough when you try to digitize it all, and we've been working on that, and we're continuing to collaborate with our partners in user services and IT at Howard Tilden to get that job done. I think we're probably about 80% there. The Ralston Crawford collection is a discrete collection of 800 images by a known Canadian artist, graphics artist, but also a fantastic photographer. Between 1949 and 61, he went deep in New Orleans and the black community. The archive purchased those images with the rights to them from Ralston Crawford in the 1970s, thanks to Dick Allen, at a very good price. And so that's material that we digitized and put online. Obviously, you've got to have the copyright to not only place that material on the internet, but to preserve it in many cases, to create digital surrogates. You need to own the copyright, and in many cases it's not all that clear. Prior to 23, it's public domain, we can work with that material. So, you know, there are some constrictions in terms of the preservation work we can do or how much we can put on the internet. And I'm happy to say, because I'll be retiring at the end of the year, at the end of December 2017, pretty much everything that we own is now available on the internet. And so, you know, this service point is unique because it's not just people looking at manuscripts, it's musicians trying out sheet music on this piano, it's people listening to music, watching film, going through photography, accessing vertical files. There's a lot going on. And so there's going to be some noise generated. No one's ever really complained. If Tom McDermott comes in here and plays this piano because he's trying out some sheet music, researchers sitting in the next room are pretty happy to hear it. We have Tulane staff who come in and they just want to listen to CDs or LPs on their lunch break. And they'll sit at this little playback machine we have in the patron area, and we just let them go. You know, we bring them whatever LPs and let them play them for themselves, and they enjoy that. And so you don't even have to be doing scholarship. So my feeling is I would like to see all that continue. The unique appeal of this environment was customized to serve various clients who have different interests and different levels of scholarly interest. And some people, it's just jazz lovers from all over the world. This is the shrine. They want to come just experience it. So I see that continuing. I think as long as New Orleans jazz is relevant, and you know, during Katrina they almost counted us out, and it turns out that we were a lot more resilient than anyone could have imagined. And I'm speaking as a New Orleans musician as well as an archivist and historian. And I think New Orleans music, you know, got a boost by Katrina in many ways, even though we took some very bad hits and we lost some people.
Did you lose anything from the archive?
No,
storm
we did
damage?
not, and in fact, one of the benefits, although it's a hard message to convey to the community, is that archival repositories tended to weather that storm pretty well. Notarial archives had some problems, certainly our music library had some problems because they were in the basement and they got 8 feet of water. Special collections, our basement in Jones Hall, 4 feet of water, we lost a lot. Some of that we were able to reclaim thanks to Belfour, but private individuals who had collections in their residences, people like Dr. Michael White, who lived a block away from the London Avenue Canal Breach, lost everything. And there was irreplaceable material. He had oral history interviews of his own. We were able to restore elements. Michael White was related to Papa John Joseph, to Plas Johnson, to a long litany of great jazz musicians. And we had interviews with some of those people. We had photographs of some of those people. We were able to restore some things that were lost to these individuals. But that's the tip of the iceberg. What they lost could not be restored. So that was a lesson we learned, is earning the trust of the community and bringing in that material for security and safety and access is very important, but it's something you have to work on all the time. Tulane is still perceived as a white institution, and New Orleans jazz and so much of New Orleans music emanates from a black vernacular sensibility, comes out of the black community here and the Creole communities. You need to invite those people in. They need to know they're welcome here, and I think we made progress during my curatorship. People like Danny Barker and Nicholas Payton, they come. Bruce Barnes, they come. They know they're going to be welcome, and they know there's material here that is going to help them with their research needs. But we have to reiterate that message constantly, and we have to earn that trust over and over again. Every year we have to earn it again. And so far we've been successful, I think, but we could always do better. And so that's really where we're focusing our sights, is that there's always room for improvement. We've been able to use digital technology and the opportunities that the internet provide to improve services. And we've had to do it with less staff, and we're going to continue to cope with those challenges. But for us, providing those services, state-of-the-art provision of services, is our goal. And I feel pretty good about not only have we accomplished it, we're going to continue to accomplish it after I leave.
That's wonderful. That leads me into my next, probably penultimate question. What accomplishments are you most proud of during your career here at Tulane?
When I began as curator in January 1989, I had a professional position, I had a half-time professional position, and I had 3 FTE paraprofessional positions. I am now down to 1 professional position, myself, and 2 paraprofessionals, FTEs. My number 1 accomplishment as curator of this archive, I feel, is to create a staff that excels on all levels despite the downsizing. And so when I hired Lynn Abbott, who is our associate curator for recorded sound material, and Elena Hebert, who is our associate curator for graphics material, I put those down as my number 1 accomplishments for those years on my annual report, because Elena is a fully credentialed librarian holding a paraprofessional position. This is typical in academia today, but she is absolutely spectacular at operations, ranging from digital to patron services. She created our new brochure, which is fantastic. Everybody loves it. She is the one responsible for the look of our website and most of the digital databases that are accessible through that website. Lynn is a published author who is world-renowned on writing about the emergence of black vernacular music with a collaborator named Doug Seroff. Most of their books are at University Press in Mississippi. They're working, I think, on their 4th now. So they've written about blues, they've written about vaudeville, they've written about tent shows, they've written about sacred and gospel music, and it's superb work. And Lynn is also a professional drummer, worked with Bruce Dickerpont's Cajun band for many, many years, and he's done other projects as well. So the talents, that staff, you know, we are lean and mean. And we pride ourselves on patron services. And the imperative for us is when a researcher walks through the door, the processing stops, and we turn our full attention to assisting that researcher, or as many researchers as show up. And there are times when we are really hard pressed. We might have a group of 30 people come in. We manage. We found ways to do this, and we excel. So I'd put that staff up against any archival staff anywhere on the planet. And you know, we have competition from Rutgers, the Institute of Jazz Studies, and there are other jazz archives around the country and throughout the world. But I don't think anyone has a better web presence than we do, and I don't think anyone has a more qualified staff. And we get the responses from users that we desire, which is they are enthusiastic in promoting the services that we provide. The other thing I would claim for myself is that I recognized that by the time I inherited the archive and the mantle of the curatorship in 1989, preservation was going to be a huge issue. And what also dawned on me very early in my curatorship was that I couldn't preserve everything, that I would have to triage and really work on the most important material, which for me has always been the oral history. And it's unique material. It's the largest jazz oral history collection in the world, and it really goes far back. In terms of its collective memory, it predates jazz. And so that's what we did, and we began working on it. You know, there was debate about whether digital was actually a better medium for shelf life than open reel tape, or many people still believe open reel tape is longer lasting. But once the Library of Congress converted to digital formats as their preferred medium, we did too. And I was on various NHPRC grants and NEH grants doing reports, and saw what was happening with the shift in the 90s. And so we began getting busy on doing sort of incremental, a little bit here, a little bit there, with a couple $1,000s here, a couple $1,000s there, in testing the waters on digital transfer of the analog tapes that we had, which, you know, beginning in 1958, that 25-year sort of outer limit of shelf life, we had surpassed that a long time ago. We got closer to 50 years by the time the Grammy project was done. But Jay Pritzker Foundation contributed, the Jazz Commission of the New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park gave us a couple $1,000s for some pilot projects. And then post-Katrina, 2006, 2008, the Grammy Foundation gave us $40,000, which allowed us to finish off the digital conversion. Triple redundancy, so very dense wave masters that get incubated and in servers. Some less robust WAV files for CDs that we provide on the premises, and then MP3 files for the web. A couple years after that, about 2011-12, Music Rising shows up, a nonprofit dedicated to preserving New Orleans music traditions post-Katrina. Rock music producer Bob Ezrin, collaborating with the guitarists from U2, The Edge, and the Gibson Guitar Foundation, gave Tulane $1 million to build a curriculum online called Musical Culture of the Gulf South. And we were part of that project at the back end, so we used under $100,000, frankly. We did it on the cheap to place the digital transfers online with transcripts whenever possible. So check that off my bucket list. You know, pretty much that oral history is available not only to scholars, but to the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the informants that we interviewed beginning in 1958 in the community. they can now listen to the voices of their forebears and relate to that and see that their families were involved in this great cultural pursuit that put the United States on the map as far as the rest of the world was concerned. Jazz being the great American art form, it pretty much is an international consensus around that now. I also wanted to raise money, and of course going out and beating the bushes for money and twisting arms for donors of big ticket items is, not something I'm all that comfortable with. I chose academia because I didn't want to become a salesman, didn't want to become a businessman, didn't want to become an attorney, etc. But good service sometimes attracts something. You don't have to go asking for it, it'll come to you. And we had a Swedish donor named Björn Barnheim who took me out to lunch one day and said that he had about $250,000 of ABB stock and he wanted to donate it to the archive. So that worked out, and we were able to set up an endowed fund which we now use to generate up to 5 fellowships a year to bring graduate students and postdocs to study for a minimum of 2 weeks at the archive, $1,500 a pop, so it helps with the expenses. And the account generates enough where we can also divert some of that money to preservation projects. So we've been able to take the kind of foundation that the Grammy Foundation provided with the oral history and to build on that with Barnheim funds. So those were the things that I really wanted to accomplish, and I got it done. The thing I'd like to say about the decades I've enjoyed as curator of the Jazz Archive, I worked my way up from the bottom, but I've always appreciated the level of collaboration and teamwork that I've experienced at the Howard Tilton Memorial Library. I really think that's the strength of our team, that we represent different interests and sometimes in conflict, but we manage to resolve issues as they arrive, and we have learned to collaborate effectively. Post-Katrina, we lost a lot of people after the voluntary separation package inaugurated by President Fitz when he came in about 2.5 years ago. All of that has reduced our ranks, but I think we have managed to attract young talent, and we continue to get better and to meet the challenges that downsizing present to us. And I think the key to that is the spirit of collaboration that prevails here. And so I just want to say that I retire from this position with some regret because I really enjoyed being curator of the Hogan Jazz Archive and director of special collections. People, tell me, boy, that's like a dream job, and they're right, it is. It allowed me to bring together my experience as a musician and a historian, and to help people, and to get some of my own work done. But I really want to thank everybody, and I'm leaving with a great deal of satisfaction that as a member of this team, I think we've accomplished a lot over the decades, and Tulane University is a good place to work, and I think we can all be proud of what we've done. And so, let me just encourage you to keep it going and pay it forward into the future.